I'm going to talk to you a few minutes today about some of the things that we've already discussed over the last few weeks. I just want to reflect on a few of these things. The first is this, is I can, because of Christ. Because of Jesus Christ, I can do incredible things. We have been taught all our lives that we cannot do a lot of things. But it is very encouraging to know that through Jesus Christ, we can do amazing things. To do all you want to do in life, your want to has to be the same as his want to. That's one of the incredible keys, the important keys to being able to do what is truly the very best in our lives. It's because of Christ, it is through Christ, and the way that happens is our will, our desires are completely geared towards pleasing God and letting God do all he desires for us. So all you want to do in life, your want to has to be the same as his want to. When my want to is the same as his want to, I have full reason to believe that his want to will take place. Because his want to is my want to. And whenever my want to is the same as his, what I desire is the same as his, it will take place. It can take place. Now, the way that it will take place is whenever we not only submit to allowing him to lead us, but in that leading, we also allow him to lead us in every specific manner. When we allow him complete control, it absolutely takes place. Also this, I can live in my promised land. Now, remember the children of Israel were connected with this, or they helped us understand how exactly this worked. Our promised land is the place in life that God wants us to live in. That is the very best that we can hope for, the very best that can take place in our lives. The ways that we can be the most successful in life, both temporal and for eternity. Our promised land is beyond what we can imagine, but it is precisely, it is exactly what God desires for us, and God will enable to take place in our lives when we do what he desires for us to do. Remember, the children of Israel were faced with the opportunity to go into the promised land, and they did not have the faith. So they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and then finally they were able to go into the promised land. But in both cases, the first time and the second time, they had a choice. And this choice determined whether they did what God desired for them to do, and in turn entered their promised land. And it determined whether they did that or whether they did not do that. Their faith, when it was different than God's will, equaled no promised land. It's going to be the same with us. Whenever we do not desire what God desires, whenever our desires are our own, we will not be able to engage in the very best that God desires for us. Their faith being different than God's will equaled no promised land. Now, their faith being the same as God's will did equal promised land. We talk about faith a lot. And faith is a very, very important word, but it can be very, very much misunderstood. It's easy for us to think that faith is our really wanting some things very, very bad, and God's saying, wow, they want this really bad, so I will give this to them. And it is not that way. There are occasional times when God actually does that, but let me tell you, it is never the very best for us. It usually backfires on us. It usually does not turn out near like we hope it will turn out. When we live by our will, we die by our will all the time. But when we live by God's will, we live by his will. That's not only temporal, but that's forever. When we live by our will, we lose all the time. When we live by God's will, we win. Why is it so hard to do this? There's such a strong desire inside of us to do what we want to do that we have to constantly allow God to gain victory over that. so that our desires become His. We always want what we think is the very best for us. And ladies and gentlemen, it really never is. It may partially be, but we don't fully understand. God's desire is always the best. When we live by God's will, we always win. Those of you who have been told all your life that you're a loser, those of you who have told yourself that you're a loser, need to take note that through God, you are never a loser. Never. We live or die by our decision to choose God's will or to not choose God's will. No matter what goes on in life. Success or failure is determined by what choice we make. I can also change. I can do all things through Christ, including change. This is one of the hardest things that it seems that we're able to do in many regards. There's some things in life that we find it easy to do differently. We change with the wind on some things, but a lot of things where it's really hard for us to change on. Remember Gideon. Remember that he had 32,000 soldiers, warriors, that the children of Israel, God was leading the children of Israel to go and win victory over his enemy. Gideon had 32,000 soldiers, and God said that's too many. So God reduced it twice, and it eventually went from 32,000 to 300. 300 warriors. Now, that sounds crazy, doesn't it? 32,000 to 300. God is the one who led him to do this, to reduce it in this manner. Not only did God reduce the amount of people, but God also changed the weaponry. God changed it from swords and spears to pitchers and trumpets. Now, that's a lot of difference in what our eyes, our minds think of as something that will succeed in battle, isn't it? But God did these two things. Now, let us comprehend that this is common sense. This would be crazy to do if it was not with God's will. If it was against God's will, this would be absolutely insane, wouldn't it? It would not make any sense whatsoever. It would be crazy to do this if it was against God's will. On the contrary, it would be crazy not to do this since it was God's will. Crazy is gauged by whose side we're on, who we allow to control our lives. What is crazy and what is faith is determined by what is God's will and what is not God's will. The only reasonable response in life is to seek God's will and to believe that He will deliver. This is the reasonable response. There's a lot of times we think a lot of things that are not very reasonable. And every single time that we think in a way different than this, we think we are being reasonable, but we are being actually unreasonable. The most reasonable thing we can ever think of is to do exactly what God desires for us to do. And to follow Him. To go with what He says to go with. To do it the way He says to do it. The children of Israel showed a lack of faith when they felt Goliath was too big to defeat. You remember David, who had great faith? David knew that Goliath was too big to miss. It's a big difference, isn't it? David destroyed the enemy with a stone and a slingshot. And all of the warriors with the swords and the spears were afraid because they were using their own heart's desire, their own idea, rather than trusting in what God was leading them to do. Pleasing God requires us to be willing to change. If we are not willing to change, we cannot please God. The deciding factor is my willingness to let God change Not only me, but to change what I do and how I do it. That's all aspects of our lives. The only way that Jesus will walk with you is that you walk with him. We don't look at Jesus and say, Jesus, I'm going this way, so come along with me. We look at Jesus and say, which way are you going? Because I want to go with you. That's how we walk with Jesus. That's how Jesus walks beside us, is that we're going the way that he desires for us to go. The will here, the ultimate goal, the ultimate desire, the ultimate decision maker is him. And our decision is in regards to our cooperation with his decision. Remember that it is better to go into battle with nothing except Jesus than it is to go into battle with everything. It's better to go into battle with nothing except Jesus than it is to go into battle with everything except Jesus. Am I saying that right? To go into battle with nothing except Jesus is better than to go into battle with everything except Jesus. Yes. Nothing but Jesus, and we're good. No matter what we have. If we do not have Jesus, we will lose. Win or loss is determined by Jesus, by our willingness to follow him. So, ladies and gentlemen, I can, and you can. No matter what you think of yourself or others tell you, let Jesus remind you that you can. I want to encourage you to believe it, and I want to encourage you to live it every day of your life. We all not only can, but we will when we follow the will of God. Every time, all the time, without exception. Thanks be to God.